Well, thanks for letting me know, Ice Bear. So, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Sunday Stream. And for most of us who are still over here on the West Coast, or in the United States, the Western Hemisphere, today is Halloween. And I thought, in the spirit of the holiday, regardless of your opinion on it, I thought that we would talk about a rather moribund topic, something that is just a little bit scary to think about, especially as it has been for numerous generations before mine, ever since the end of the Second World War, living in that constant relative fear of the idea of nuclear weapons. And as I've mentioned on a previous video, that the idea of the scariest film of all time for me was the documentary I watched at Los Alamos nuclear testing site when I was in high school, talking about the testing and development of nuclear weapons and the arms race that pursued it, which of course is a very strange thing for a teenager to be, fearful of, knowing that that's still a very real possibility. But with all that being said, I do want to apologize to you all for the lateness of the stream. I'm currently having to isolate right now for COOF-related reasons, but all should be well for everyone who's involved. So I thank you all for your patience. But today we'll be talking about the Nuclear Triad, at least the American one, because that has the most publicly available information in regards to its current nuclear capabilities, as well as the diplomatic efforts around why nations pursue nuclear weapons, why countries go on to pursue them or develop them regardless of international treaties, or the threat that may come from poor management or lack of technological access. So there's really a lot to break down today. So with that being said, I'd like to just give a brief outline here. The global state of nuclear weapons, I do have the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists image of, 100 seconds to midnight on the right. We'll talk about that as well as the updates of the last 2 decades and regarding to some weapons regarding nuclear technology. It won't cover everything, but I think that some of this information is pertinent into what we'll be discussing, as well as a brief introduction to what the nuclear triad is for those unfamiliar, along with the U.S. aging nuclear triad, as well as efforts to modernize it. And then I wanted to cover a very interesting debate that has been ongoing in the international relations community for some time, that talks about the idea of whether or not the proliferations of nuclear weapons are still viable, or a viable strategy in terms of international deterrence in a bipolar and now multipolar world. So Waltz says yes, Scott Sagan says no. So there's definitely a lot for us to cover today. So let's get started. So, nuclear weapons in the world today. So, as of 2019, which is what the data I have next to me right now, there hasn't been too much talking about how many weapons are out there. There is an estimated 13,485 or so nuclear weapons that are known to exist in the world today, with, of course, the Russian Federation, the former Soviet Union, and the United States of America possessing the most nuclear weapons, which had much more, despite the aspects of the non-proliferation treaty, the test ban treaties, the arms reduction, SALT I, SALT II, and the American pursuit of détente with the Soviet Union towards the end of the Cold War. Yet, despite the ongoing destructive nature of nuclear weapons and the fear that exists of nuclear terrorism and non-state actors pursuing it, nation states and their governments that are not nuclear armed threshold states are still pursuing it. And the ongoing question around this is how much of America's, as well as the rest of the world's nuclear technology, would still be used. The United States, of course, identifies this annually in what is something known as I believe it's called the Nuclear Posture Review, NPR, which we'll be discussing later, that sort of delves into the issue of how many of these weapons still work, what are their current active status, and what other nation states are pursuing them. And so, as you can see on the image to the right, we can have a really good idea of who are some of the power players in the world. Of course, many of the post-war states that we see on the United Nations Security Council as permanent members, Russia, the United States, France, the UK, and China, are all in possession of nuclear weapons. The correct data, however, for nation states below are mainly liberal estimates in regards to how many weapons they may have, especially when it comes to Pakistan, India, and North Korea. Israel, we do know, possesses nuclear weapons, which makes them, one of the more primary states to be concerned about in the Middle East, because no other nation can really engage in a full-on state-on-state actor regardless, because there is the concern of nuclear deterrence and desperation, something which we'll be talking about later. However, in the 21st century, as the idea of a unipolar world is the concept and the fear that they can no longer be necessarily dependent and they can no longer be reliant on nuclear armed nations that they have necessarily been under their security umbrella. This conversation has been going around as early as the Clinton administration during the end of the Cold War and sort of the issues that are happening on in Bosnia and Serbia and other interventions globally as they recognize that other nations are pursuing hegemony and power around the claim. Now, this means that allied dependent nations, specifically along the lines of Japan, South Korea, have been very concerned about whether or not they can rely on the American security umbrella and the nuclear deterrence that comes with the United States in their own field. So this, again, has become a very strong question that other countries have been asking. And there's a lot that we can take a look at that in today's discussion. So within the last 2 decades, these are not all of the major events and news that are coming around the discussion of nuclear weapons, but I think these are very pertinent ones to consider, especially when we look at how nation states that are nuclear armed and other non-nuclear threshold states engage in the discussion of nuclear enrichment, nuclear weapons, and the development of deterrence technologies, as well as their own missile silos and triad options. So for both the United States and the Russian Federation, they both have experienced within the last 20 years issues when it comes to both dismantling and testing nuclear weapons in the future. Specifically, the idea that for instance, the United States had an issue in 2002, I believe, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in regards to radiation leaks, and the Russians had one very similarly about 5 or 6 years ago in 2016, I believe. But again, a small radiation leak and quarantining and treating those for mild radiation poisoning is nothing in consideration to what else has been happening across the world. More specifically, is one event that happened in 2007, which is known as Operation Outside of the Box, which is what the United States providing intelligence services to the Israeli Mossad and targeting Bashar al-Assad as he is ascending to power and taking control of the Syrian government, are bombing what is considered to be an alleged nuclear enrichment facility. This was done by flying through Turkish airspace and was conducted in the middle of the night, with alleged counterintelligence operations and electronic warfare being used on the grounds that their radar detection were being displayed a false screen. There is enough publicly available information. Some say it was a chemical warfare plant. Others say that it talked about, nuclear enrichment to reach the necessary threshold in which one state could pursue building nuclear weapons. This happened in 2007, and this is an excellent example of what we'll be talking about later when it comes to the concept of nuclear war and preventative conflict from preventing nations from achieving nuclear threshold status. And in fact, one of the, with Israel even having nuclear weapons to begin with, has the wonderful affair of certain technologies from the United States also being taken from us as well. So there's a lot that comes into how nations pursue nuclear weapon states, taking advantage of other resources, smuggling, illicit trade, or even openly negotiating to talk about it. Something of which the Saudi Arabians have been discussing for some time about getting technical expertise or buying necessary fissile material in some form or fashion from the Pakistanis who are pursuing their own, they have their platform, they have their program, and they're seriously considering providing nuclear weapons to the Middle East, or at least the Saudi Arabians in previous discussions, although the state of those talks have not really gotten too far, considering the pressure from Americans and other actors in the region, Russia and China being considered as well. On top of this, there's also been an ongoing debate in American policymaking, as well as something that we'll be probably seeing sometime next year, which is the argument about no first use. So the United States for a long time has not necessarily declared themselves a no first use nation. They have second strike capability. There's not really a reason to discuss it. But there is the ongoing debate, as with every president that comes into office, about the nuclear posture review, about whether or not the United States will adopt a no first use policy, which is indicative that if it comes to this, that the United States will not use nuclear weapons first in any form of aggression or act of aggression against other nation states. Because any time that we consider about turning the key and using these weapons, oftentimes it's gotten to a point where either A, the desperation of it is, pertinent to actually make action very quickly and effectively, Or secondly, the idea that, posturing yourself to be offensive makes, diplomatic engagements very uneasy and very likely to not work. So that makes it very difficult when it comes to the issue of ongoing debate of a first use policy. If there's any sort of graphical or audio issues that are happening right now, I'm in a vastly different location, and I do apologize for that. Some stuff happened earlier today, which I'll disclose. I may have been exposed to the coof, so I'm trying my best to isolate and stay away from people. So I'm not where I'm usually at to do the show, and I apologize for that. But carrying on with the presentation and today's discussion on nuclear weapons, as we've more recently been seeing in talking about the idea of armaments and new types of technologies, and we'll break more into this when we talk about the Triad, there has been testing of technologies, whether that's scramjet, jet engines for faster delivery systems for bomber aircraft, or automated weapons that could deliver a nuclear payload, or what we've more recently seen with the Chinese about hypersonic glide test missiles, which have a much different way of delivering nuclear payloads than traditional ICBMs or our current Triad technologies, have all made it very interesting in the pursuit of nuclear weapons. Even while China is a nuclear-armed state, the issue of deterrence has been one of the most prominent for them, on top of the fact that they are constantly facing the American policy of Soviet-esque containment from the American military and its defense umbrella. Specifically, as it realizes that there's been more encroachment on the South China Sea, the issue of Taiwan, which is what we'll be talking about next Sunday, all illustrates the desire to find ways to deter other powers from being involved in what they consider to be issues of national sovereignty, which is one of the biggest reasons why nations pursue nuclear weapons if they are already not a nuclear threshold or a nuclear armed state. And we'll break those terms down in just a bit. But firstly, we should probably be discussing what on earth is the nuclear triad. I've been using the word triad a lot lately in the last 15 minutes or so, which of course is not in relation to any sort of Chinese gang or organized crime association, but rather it is the primary three-pronged approach for the delivery of nuclear ordnance. This is around land, air, and sea-based delivery mechanisms. These mechanisms include the idea of aerial, so often nuclear-capable aircraft, which the United States has things ranging from the B-52H bomber to the F-15E Eagle, which all have the capability of delivering nuclear-based ordnance across, whatever theater of war that they may be in, along with, of course, nuclear-powered submarines that have the capability to deliver a nuclear payload. And most traditionally, and what we see out usually in the middle of nowhere in the country, are ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile silos, along with previously during the Cold War, intermediate range ballistic missiles, which could carry a nuclear payload. The United States still uses I believe it's the Minuteman III, which carries 3 nuclear warheads in most of its submarine and ICBM silos. So it does have the capability of providing a land, air, and sea-based approach. This doesn't mean that they aren't pursuing other delivery options. Both the Chinese and the Americans are pursuing the policy of, new ways of delivery. This includes hypersonic technology as well as the orbital option. So we often talk about in science fiction, like, the rods from God, but the idea of delivering nuclear weapons via an orbital platform that can either survive re-entry or be in low atmosphere to avoid that issue will happily be discussed in technology and the development, both from the United States, but other parties as well. On top of this, however, nation-states often will continually question and review their nuclear capabilities. I know that Charlemagne in the chat earlier was questioning how many of America's nuclear weapons would actually work if tested, especially because the United States hasn't really tested any nuclear weapons in a very long time, although we were recently beginning to test them in 2019, back in August. This is after the Trump administration opted to withdraw from the the INF, the Intermediate Range Treaty, in regards to testing. So the United States is kind of beginning to resume nuclear weapons testing from the Trump administration. The Biden administration has not re-entered this treaty to the extent of my knowledge, nor have they made any real difference on their posture from the previous administration in regards to weapons. And so, I know that in the chat someone mentioned the Samson option, the idea that if Israel's sovereignty or territory were to ever be violated, or, there were troops of, non-Israeli origin on the ground, that nuclear weapons would be used. Whether you're, people get talked about this in, the Sum of All Fears or something like that. But that option was indeed a very real policy, and it's been the subject of a lot of fiction in a long time. But of all countries that are particularly secretive about their nuclear weapons, that are a part of the international community, it would definitely be the Israelis that provide the least amount of information for obvious reasons. In the same way that we don't know too much about their technology or what they get from us, because a lot of the times what they get from us ends up in the hands of the Chinese. So again, not a lot of information I can really discuss there. But on the right, you'll see that I do have a picture of the B-52H bomber. There are over 75 of them still in active service that are a part of America's nuclear triad option, although there has been ongoing criticism both from non-proliferation activists to more hawkish individuals that would be very concerning, because the B-52H, of course, B-52, it entered service back then. It has been around for a very long time, and that's where we're at. So Iron Dragon says the United States made a nuclear submarine deal with Australia, and we've entered the age of the United States allowing other countries to use its arsenal without breaking non-proliferation rules. If you'll notice that the AUKUS agreement, Mr. Dragon, does not allow the Australians to actually use those nuclear-powered submarines to deliver nuclear weapons. Furious Pertinax was very clear, I believe, on this stream not too long ago when we talked about the AUKUS agreement, that Australia has very stringent rules about the use of nuclear power, the use of nuclear technology, as do their New Zealander neighbors. So there's definitely a lot in there that, while they're nuclear powered, they will not be armed with nuclear weapons per this agreement that we know of so far. I doubt that they could get away with it. It would be a major scandal, both domestically for Australia, but it would also be an open violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which the United States is still a signatory and ratified nation-state member of. But nations do question their capabilities, and nations that are looking to pursue it are looking even for a way to have even one bomb, because one is enough to start being recognized at the seat of the table of international affairs. And there's a lot of theory based around this, which we can also talk into today. So, like I mentioned earlier, the argument is about the American nuclear triad, as I said earlier, because it has the most available public information. And the information that we have is about the United States Nuclear Posture Review, NPR. And that's what it's known as in the defense circles, the NPR. It's the only good NPR because you actually learn something rather than getting a bunch of liberal garbage. But since Bill Clinton was in office in 1994, was when the first nuclear posture review was conducted, other than the Department of Defense putting it in their annual review of their, cabinet secretary's report. This allows each new incoming president, within 1 year of being in office, so 1994 was when they started this policy, and since then, every president that comes into office, George W. Bush got his a year after coming into office in 2002, Barack Obama got his in 2010, and President Trump got his in 2018, and President Biden, for better or for worse, will be getting his sometime next year. The last one, of course, was conducted by Defense Secretary James Mattis, and it illustrated the issue that the United States will continue to posture its nuclear weapons purely for deterrent purposes. They're not likely to use them in any sort of aggressive manner. However, the Trump administration opted to withdraw from the Intermediate Range, Nuclear Missile Test Treaty, and also known as the INF, which has allowed the Trump administration and now this current government to engage in a nuclear weapons testing for intermediate range. All of this allows them to test ballistic missiles that you would have seen during the time of the Cold War that were postured in Turkey, which caused, of course, the issue of the Cuban Missile Crisis. All of this is indicative that the Trump administration is pursued a far more realist option, or at least a more hawkish one. I would say neo-realist, that you need to recognize what your options actually are. And of course, the American, NPR has indicated that the current testing facilities that we have to make sure it's very difficult to actually test what nuclear weapons and what ICBMs we actually still have that would actually work. Predominantly because we haven't tested them in forever. We don't do above ground testing. We don't do atmospheric testing anymore. And we rarely, if ever, have looked at pursuing underground nuclear weapons testing, because that is incredibly easy to detect, and thus would put the problem up of, violation of treaties. However, this has allowed the INF to be no longer an issue, which puts us up to no longer look at the worries of, testing. The United States can now pursue it. Russia has in turn, no longer is a member of this treaty. which prior to Trump's withdrawal from this treaty, the Russian Federation was constantly haranguing the United States and the United Nations Security Council, saying that the INF and other nuclear disarmament treaties between the United States and Russia do not go far enough, because they do not incorporate other countries that are pursuing nuclear weapons. They do not look at the fact that China has nuclear weapons, the UK or France or any other major nuclear armed state, which a lot of the concern primarily is around India and Pakistan, for reasons that we'll get into much later today in the conversation between Scott Sagan and Kenneth Waltz. There haven't been any underground nuclear missile tests, I believe, since like 1992 per treaties that came between the then Soviet Union, now Russian Federation, of the United States. These critical tests that we do, as the NPR of even 2018 talked about, are not a very good way to gauge how much they would work, how they would go off. A lot of our nuclear infrastructure does need an update, which has been something called upon from non-proliferation experts, American neoconservatives, foreign experts, even individuals like the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, because this technology, of course, without being tested for a very long time, you're only running subcritical or electronic tests or modeling, illustrates the fact that this technology needs to be updated. The Triad needs to be updated. The B-52s and the B-1 bombers are desperately in need of being updated. They are looking at what is called the B-21 Raider, which is an update to the B-2 bomber with increased stealth capabilities, and the argument that it can carry, or at least it's told that it can carry a much larger nuclear payload and stay up in the air a lot longer, along with necessary electronic countermeasures in case nuclear weapons were to go off. And on the right, you'll see an artist's rendition of the Columbia-class submarine, which is slated to be out sometime in the 2030s, to replace our current aging fleet of Ohio-class nuclear submarines that currently carry our submarine-based nuclear missiles, which I believe are still Trident. Trident's the Brits. Ours is the Minuteman III that we currently use. But this is where we're currently at with the American Nuclear Triad. So I'm going to just take a look at chat real quick before carrying on. Let's see here. Talking about anti-nuclear weapons propaganda or the fear of nuclear weapons. I mean, there's a lot of good fiction that talks about it. I think Failsafe's pretty good. The Japanese probably have the best one. I think it's Barefoot Gen, which talks about a kid that survives the atomic bombing at Hiroshima. Those are some really good ones. For modern day, like nuclear weapons, like fiction, there's a really good book. I think it's by Greg Bear called Able 1, which talks about America's like anti-nuclear weapons, laser technology, which is mounted on an experimental 747 airliner that is equipped with a laser that's meant to like burn off and stop a nuclear weapon from reaching that threshold before it can't be intercepted. And it's trying to stop a rogue North Korean sect of the military from launching a nuclear weapon, all at the same time with like mystery and self-sabotage and figuring it out with a military and civilian crew. It's a really good book. But I mean, for anti-nuke propaganda or anti-nuclear weapons films, I think Failsafe or Barefoot Gen are probably one of your best ones to talk about. The UGM, okay, it is Trident 2. Okay, thank you, T. I knew that I was right there. But okay, let's take a look. Let's see what else everyone's saying before we can carry on. Okay, we do use the Trident check. Cool. Appreciate it. Well, Charlemagne, I'm just going to go put that on screen for everybody to enjoy. But on with our current discussion. So why do nations pursue these weapons? Which, of course, seems to be like a very obvious question. The realist perspective will tell you that because the world is this anarchic and rather hellish place with no existing international world order, no existing international governance, that in order to improve your chance on the international pecking order and to get what you want, pursuing a nuclear threshold or actually, maintaining a nuclear arsenal is the quickest way to, gain status and to put yourself up on the world order, and especially to get attention from countries like the United States or Russia or China, your three largest powers that are nuclear armed states today in the world. On the right, you'll see lovely images from the, North Korea. that discusses the idea of having nuclear weapons. Some will tell you in the international relations and foreign policy community that the nuclear capabilities of the North Koreans are greatly exaggerated, that this is a way to leverage and use their position as a nuclear armed state to get what they want, whether it's sanctions relief, humanitarian aid, or loans or credit from certain countries. This happens specifically a lot with the Chinese, which sort of becomes this odd quagmire between the United States and the People's Republic of China, because, of course, North Korea does pursue nuclear weapons testing. They are pursuing fissile materials. They are having enrichment facilities. But at the same time, you don't want to go with the and actually engage, one, out of fear of nuclear retaliation, and not to mention that those missiles could easily hit South Korea, Seoul, and other cities within there. And that brings up a whole other debate that we can talk about at the end of this slide here. But the second one, right, is that there's the security model. This gets discussed a lot by the three causes for why nation states pursue nuclear weapons by Scott Sagan. He talks about the fact that nations that do not have nuclear weapons that do pursue it, that are usually called either latent nuclear states, which are states that have the capability to create fissile material for weapons, or are capable of producing it in a very short amount of time, or those that don't even have that capability at all. They pursue it to ensure the national sovereignty of a nation. An argument that you will hear from the Iranians, and an argument that you will hear from the Pakistanis about why they pursue nuclear weapons, is to avoid other nations from encroaching upon national sovereignty. In fact, the United States gets referenced a lot of times in regards to why they pursue it. And because the United States can easily intervene, you can still have conventional wars that happen inside of their nation state's territory, where you can't act like the Russians. The Russians have been very clear, at least under Putin's reign, that if nuclear weapons were to be used on Russia, or nuclear weapons would be used on Russian soil if the territorial sovereignty were encroached by foreign troops. So to take steps or to take foot on Russian soil as an invading military force, there would be arguments that, or there would be use of nuclear weapons, as argued by the Putin administration under official policy. That is a way in which nation states pursue it under the security model. The same way that Syria was considering it, in the same way that Iran still pursues it, all of which they try in order to defend international sovereignty, especially because in the world order, you know that you're not necessarily the nation state that can defend itself, or that perceives itself to be under threat from a greater issue of foreign engagement, intervention, and that can also be done through economics as well. So why on earth would you try and mess around or screw with a nuclear-armed state that would ensure that, you know, your sovereignty is being invested or invaded by? And the fact is that we've seen this happen from other areas as well, whether it's the Budapest Memorandum and the consequent security agreements from states like the United States with the Ukrainian government for dismantling its nuclear weapons and handing them over to the Russians for dismantlement. We can talk about that in just a little bit. And even then, other nuclear weapons that get used are oriented around tactical ones. Specifically, the idea that you're going to have small, low-yield, small kiloton level warheads in order to destroy an enemy's, base of forward operating base, key infrastructure for manufacturing weapons and technology, all of which is there to talk about how to defend key areas as well as how to use them tactically. There's been lovely ongoing conversations in the non-proliferation world, as well as the Americans, that, you know, try and game theory out what sort of nuclear weapons would be used if war were to be broken out. Where would they be targeted? The great fear that often comes up in fiction in the West, or even outside, like in Japan, is that it would be used on civilian targets and to destroy population centers. Now, there are certain cities that would probably be hit for manufacturing, or port cities. I would definitely think that New Orleans or Houston would be hit, Los Angeles as well, or any major coastal city in the United States. But the ongoing debate is whether or not you target population centers for the complete, eliminate the ability to fight back in any sort of traditional means, or to demoralize and, strike back in such a way that the nation is forced to surrender. But what most likely gets argued, and what the most probable case, is that the United States and the Soviet Union at the time when it's been argued would be targeting specifically military infrastructure. So you would have to eliminate almost immediately second strike capability. You do not want the United States or the Soviet Union to respond in such a way that they can still have a majority of their missiles intact, which is why they would say in any sort of first strike option that the Soviet Union or the United States would be targeting explicitly nuclear missile silos. They would be targeting, tactical deployment of short-range ballistic nuclear missiles, all of which would prevent your enemy from, fighting with a second strike capability. So while they're already recovering from the first strike, if they cannot retaliate, you have essentially won a limited nuclear engagement. All of which is the ongoing discussion of why a lot of the fiction that we talk about in regards to nuclear weapons would not be, targeting civilian population centers. It wouldn't be targeting major cities or high dense populations. It would be targeting, your manufacturing areas. So parts of the former Rust Belt. You would be targeting your ability to generate energy, electrical grids, oil fields, and of course, ports and manufacturing. Because if you can irradiate and eliminate the argument of, surviving and keeping up a military infrastructure of your economy, then you're not really in a position to bargain or argue with those that struck you first. Not to mention, of course, right, the problem that we're kind of facing with the coronal mass ejections that we see from the sun, right? Those can affect electronics, GPS tracking signals, all of which in its first strike capability would make it far more easier to fight back and hit them very quickly. Now, as Eisenberg also points out in chat, that there was a lot of firebombing of civilian areas in German cities in World War II, so I don't see why an army wouldn't also nuke them. The issue, right, would be, your targets are very clearly presented to you. If you want to hit a civilian population center, that's one less nuclear warhead that you're using to target an enemy's ICBM silo or a launching area of perhaps a hypersonic missile or a port that may contain housed nuclear subs that are, being repaired or being refitted or their crew is out. All of these things of which that you want to put, your priority on. That doesn't mean that we won't target civilian population centers. I'm sure that would happen. I would imagine that smaller tactical warheads would be used on, say, key medical infrastructure, manufacturing sectors, industrial plants, the energy grid. And this is, things that were theoried out back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when nuclear weapons, or the concern over nuclear weapons, was far much higher now than it is now, higher then than it is today. Not to mention, however, in the pursuit of these other technologies, whether it's orbital kill devices or hypersonic missile testing, the other fear that comes within today, especially around hypersonic missiles, which we'll talk about at some point in time in the future on this stream or on this channel, is the concern that early warning detection systems that we use to detect ICBM launches, that we test for nuclear weapons detection, all of which worries a lot of policy analysts, because there's concerns that an early warning detection system couldn't tell the difference between a hypersonic missile that does not have a nuclear warhead versus an ICBM that does. And that's actually one of the biggest fears that is currently being talked about right now when it comes to the hypersonic, glide missile that was tested by the Chinese not too long ago, because it kind of confirms the fear that, yes, these nations are going to pursue them. Obviously, they were going to pursue them, but the detection ability to do so is not yet caught up to tell the difference between, say, a traditional Tomahawk-like missile on a hypersonic rail system compared to, say, an ICBM launch. That provides a very great concern to the security dilemma, a concept which we've talked about before, that when nations pursue either defensive or offensive posturing, all that follows next is the fear that other nations will do the same, which increases the likelihood for tension or all-out conflict. And as we mentioned earlier with this on this slide about North Korea, a gentleman by the name of Stephen Betts argues in the idea that smaller states pursue nuclear weapons because they are one of three nations. They are either pygmies, paranoids, or pariahs. Paranoids are smaller nation states that fear that they are under such threat that they have to pursue nuclear deterrence. And even though the fear of said invasion, encroachment, or territorial fights are often greatly overblown in the heads of their leadership and government. Pygmy states are usually smaller nation states, so whether it's Iran or Syria, these things are going to be nations that would pursue it. And then, of course, there's pariahs, which is usually a mix of pygmies and paranoids, which is often viewed like that of South Korea pursuing nuclear weapons because they do fear of some sort of imminent attack, while at the same time they do fear, and they are an international pariah, or they are a pariah to the international community, while still being small and fearful of outside and foreign intervention, specifically from the United States and South Koreans, who have had a policy about reunification of the Korean Peninsula, usually under South Korean rule. I mean, Israel is also, I would probably consider it a paranoid state. There's enough backing from the United States. There's their relationship with Egypt, their ongoing, diplomatic dialogue with the Chinese that probably doesn't necessarily mandate the use of nuclear weapons, but both for religious and cultural and ethnic reasons, the Israelis are going to pursue a nuclear deterrence policy for, reasons that seem very obvious. And of course, deterrence is always going to be an issue for any country that already has an existing nuclear weapons program. They use, I think, what's called the F-15EI, which is the Israeli version of the F-15E Eagle to deliver a nuclear payload. I know that both Russia and the United States have airborne command planes that can launch land-based missiles in case of attack. All of which, of course, illustrates why these nations, other nations that are not nuclear armed, do not look at the argument, or do not look at nation states that pursue nukes. I mean, all of which they see that other nations have them. It allows them to have a seat at the negotiating table, even if their economy is not too great. All of which puts us out to the grave concern of, hey, some nuclear weapon states that, or at least nation states that are pursuing a nuclear threshold status, may not necessarily be as rational as others, which opens up a very good debate that we'll dive into in just a minute here. And I know for the UK's nuclear policy, I know that every time that there is a changing of hats with the Prime Minister, there is what's known as the Prime Minister's orders that are put on UK nuclear-armed submarines, which were to say, in case the United Kingdom is attacked or you do not hear from the government or nuclear weapons have been used, these are your ongoing orders and this is what you need to do. I do not know if that's changed, but last I checked, those are currently what's happening in the Prime Minister's orders. Let's see here. But all of this allows us to really dive into the debate over nuclear armed states and proliferation. So there's a really good book, and you can find sections of it for free on JSTOR and some PDFs online, which I highly recommend that you read. I've read Kenneth Waltz's work on nuclear proliferation. I have not read this book in its entirely, only selections, which I read in college. But this is called The Spread of Nuclear Weapons, A Debate Renewed. This was originally published in 2002. And the argument, of course, being that in a post-Cold War world, we should probably take a look at the idea of nuclear proliferation. So from key background, right, is that the Russia being the biggest nuclear power, and the United States being quickly close behind it during the Cold War, Kenneth Waltz, who is well known as an international realist scholar, and knowing that it is he's a defensive realist, he argued predominantly throughout the Cold War that the world was safer in a bipolar environment than a unipolar environment. Because there is this balance of power, this allows the rest of the nations to sort of pursue a camp. This is very, orthodox Cold War thinking that, this would allow us to look at a greater semblance that nuclear weapons won't be used. There's too many sides on either one to engage in, conventional warfare without nukes being used. I remember that Waltz had also argued that this bipolar world is safer because it would also be having two parties wanting to limit the proliferation of nuclear states. Now, afterwards, Waltz would later argue that more nuclear weapons, the better, in regards to nuclear proliferation, especially as it became very clear that the Soviet Union was not doing so well economically. Its military production capabilities were not up to par with the United States. And as many audiences like to talk about, including Barry Posen, when it comes to nuclear weapons and deterrence, at no point in time during the Cold War did the Soviet Union's gross domestic product ever equal the United States. It was somewhere around a 2-to-1 ratio throughout the entirety of the Cold War. And that also brings this debate up today when we talk about, say, things like China, because China has equaled, if not outmatched, the United States in GDP and gross national product parity, as well as things like purchasing power parity and so like that, the triple P. So which these two gentlemen, Scott D. Sagan, who has argued about the idea that nuclear proliferation is not going to be healthy for an international world order and security. And this debate talks about that, where Kenneth Waltz says that actually more proliferation the better, because this allows the United States to be equal, or would allow the United States and other nations to recognize each other in a more serious fashion to then avoid intervention, conflict, and ongoing anti-American blocs at the time. Keep in mind, this was in 2002, and we had just invaded Afghanistan when this war was published. But these debates go back to around the mid-90s. I think the earliest one was in 1995, so the year I was born. So these have been a very long conversations between these two scholars. Waltz argued that the pursuit is logical in an anarchic world system. Nation states want to defend their sovereignty. They want to avoid international haranguement. They don't want to avoid. They don't want to have arguments in regards to the encroachment or loans or IMF being withheld or sanctions, all of which is that they're going to pursue them. And so if by pursuing them, this is good because this allows these smaller nation states to be recognized in the international world order. When nations engage with other countries that have nukes, they're far more taken seriously. And in doing so, Waltz argues that in this anarchic world, as a realist, that we probably shouldn't be doing something to stop them from proliferating. So the more nukes, the better, which he's been criticized before in the past. There's a really good article. I think her name is like Karen Tranchberg or something, where she's her article title was called "Waltzing into Armageddon," which argued the position of Waltz is not necessarily stable. And there's a lot that we can talk about in there in just a minute when we go over the arguments. So they've been talking about this, especially in the book. They talk about the Kargil War between Pakistan and India in 1999, where there was a discussion about the use of nuclear weapons between India and Pakistan during this time. Of course, India would come out of the winner of that conflict. There was a lot of concern that nuclear weapons would be used. And that hot zone still today remains one of the biggest areas of focus between other nuclear armed states and non-proliferation activists, that nuclear weapons might be used. But because this debate occurred in 2002, I thought that it would be interesting to look at the last, 19 years or so of world events and see how much of this debate holds out. So the debate itself, these are some of the positions that are argued by Sagan and Kenneth Waltz. So I'll start with Waltz. Waltz argues, as he argued back in a 1981 paper, that more is better. More being better because this allows the rest of the world to acknowledge growth. It allows the United States and other parties to treat each other more rationally, more with more respect. The likelihood of actual conventional war decreases, and there is an effective nuclear balance of power. And when nation states manage to achieve the nuclear threshold, they're not necessarily going to be acting as reckless as they once do. He argues that nations like Iran or Pakistan or India are not going to be as reckless in their rhetoric against other nations because they are now aware very seriously of the nuclear threat and what it can actually do. And we can see somewhat now in 2021 how well this argument kind of holds up. We do see that nuclear weapons are used more so as leverage in, say, nations like North Korea. But when it comes to Iran and nuclear weapons, while the argument, of course, being used that they would use it to wipe Israel off the map and they would engage with previous rhetoric that they used during various other conflicts with the Israelis and their ongoing rhetoric, it probably wouldn't happen. Barry Posen talks about this a lot in his book Restraint, that we talked about on Prudent Reads with Mr. Mandrill and I, that you should probably go give it a watch, because I read that section where Posen argues that Iran is not nearly as radical and irrational as other actors would argue. This all puts it in mind about the idea that nations that are perceived as reckless or overly religious or fanatical, once they acquire them, they're most likely not going to be nearly as reckless, or they're not going to be nearly as, cavalier with the use of nuclear weapons, because all of a sudden you now have an international community that is very much aware of their deterrent policies. They're now going to have to be considered as a target by the United States or by Russia or by China, all of which, of course, increases, their likelihood of being taken seriously. He also argues that nuclear arms are the great equalizer, meaning that if you're going to actually go to war, or if you're going to actually use military force, it's not going to be a total war kind of situation. And this argument, I think, really holds up between those two main ones that he makes. This one holds up because in the last 20 years or so, whether it's the invasion of Georgia or the ongoing conflict in between Azerbaijan and Armenia, or even the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there wasn't a lot of, total war kind of being operated. The American economy did not go to such a position that everything was about winning this war. At the same time, right, the Russians haven't used it when they're taking a look at the Azerbaijan-Armenia issue, and nor did they use nuclear weapons when they invaded either, annexing Crimea or when taking over of Georgia in 2008. All that illustrates another concern about the worth of an American promise. It illustrates that some of the strongest nuclear-armed states in the world, the United States and the Russian Federation, are not going to be, transitioning into a total war situation. Whereas Scott D. Sagan is far more of a pessimist than Waltz has been for the last 40 or so years when it comes to nuclear realism and nuclear diplomacy. He argues quite clearly that more nuclear weapons proliferation and the more that are available and out there are actually going to make the security situation globally a lot worse, and he counters it in two areas. One, that future nuclear-armed states will not have the means to mitigate accidents or discharge of nuclear weapons without the proper control measures. So in many areas, like the United States, which is modeling it after, the United States technically has civilian control over nuclear weapons than it does the military. There has a really good, lengthy history, which I probably am going to have to do a video on or do a stream on, about the fight between the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy having control over nuclear weapons. And at the current moment in time, I believe the DOE technically has civilian regulatory control over America's nukes, which makes the idea of Department of Energy way more intense than it actually is in the past. Because, we kind of joke about Rick Perry being one of the original energy secretaries in the Trump administration. And, he's got great oil experience. He led over Texas. But how much does Rick Perry actually know about nuclear arms or nuclear armament policy, right? But the argument that Sagan makes is that, say Pakistan, continues to enrich nuclear weapons, other nations, say North Korea or Iran, get nuclear weapons, they're not going to have the necessary measures to stop, mitigate accidents, mitigate an unnecessary explosion, or even be able to contain things such as nuclear fallout, all of which makes the security situation worse because you have nations that are using reckless rhetoric, that are pursuing nuclear weapons, and in doing so, they do not have the ability to control, mitigate accidents, or even have a cogent and cohesive military structure that would prevent a different sect from taking advantage or taking control of these nuclear weapons and using them for their own fanatical purposes. And this gets talked a lot about in fiction, about some rogue nationalist sect taking control over the nuclear weapons of a small third world country. It's the plot line for virtually every spy or nuclear thriller that's out there, right? Something which is very much based in academic and policy concern because they don't have experience handling these technologies. They don't have the means or technical assistance unless they're literally importing experts from other countries, which of course is going to be detected by, intelligence apparatus, from across the world. All of which would lead to the likelihood of accident or actual nuclear conflict between other countries. And he talks about this, right? And most specifically that the rational choice theorists' discussion, or that emerging school of rational choice, does not hold up very well when it comes to nuclear weapons. Sagan, in a very realist perspective here, argues, and quote, that nuclear weapons, our management of them are, quote, controlled by imperfect humans in an imperfect system, end quote. And he argues that you cannot expect rationality everywhere. You cannot expect that when it comes time to turn your key, sir, that they will, or they may turn their key when it's actually a drill. All of which shows us that, this is an imperfect system. Accidents are still very likely to happen. In fact, the United States has a well-documented history of losing nuclear weapons, as does the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation to this day. All of which shows us the concern about this imperfect system. Stephen Chat says that Pakistan keeps their weapons disassembled in shuttles and components between bases because they're so paranoid about them falling into militant hands. Well, that's reassuring to know that Pakistan has an effective fail-safe measure to prevent the proliferation of fissile material from militants. But that doesn't mean that, say, the more hardline Islamist faction of, say, Iran may do the same. The more concern I have would be actually Saudi Arabia pursuing nuclear weapons, because I think that at least the Iranians, in the last 5 or 6 years, know pretty darn well about how to engage in diplomacy about nuclear weapons. This illustrates the concern over, Iran deciding to nuke Israel, right, or dropping a bomb in Tel Aviv. That will most likely not happen. I think mainly because we have a pretty well documented history of the Iranians wanting to pursue nuclear weapons, and probably are well within threshold status, as the claim has always been. But with the concern over Wahhabist attitudes inside the Saudi kingdom and Saudi politics, it would be greatly concerning, because, I mean, one, I would not be surprised if they try to use one against Iran. Two, I would not be surprised if they used one in their ongoing conflict in Yemen. They have wasted God knows how many M1 Abrams tanks inside Yemen in fighting, the Houthi rebels and the Iranian armaments there. All of which illustrates that these imperfect systems and imperfect people talks about the use of nuclear weapons and how they might be used by these irrational actors. And that's my hot take, I guess, for today's stream, right? Is that I am more worried about the Saudis getting a nuclear weapon than I definitely am the Iranians. I think the Iranians would be far more rational than the Saudis, purely due to ideology alone. And I mean, Houthi rebels, right? They would probably definitely use a small one, a tactical low yield weapon on them. But at the same time, right, the concern is that the counter argument would be what Waltz talks about, which is the reckless or ruthless rhetoric would probably not be used once they recognize that once you have nuclear weapons, you're probably on every other nation's targeting system, or at least has a nuke with your name on it if something were to go wrong. The other concern that both of these individuals talk about in this book is the argument over preventative warfare. And we've seen that already happen with Operation Outside the Box with the Israelis in 2007 against Syria. If there is a perceived fear that a nation that is very close to your borders is going to pursue nuclear weapons, and does not mean that you are going to, think that they're going to not use them on you, then yeah, preventative war is probably going to happen. And they conducted airstrikes to, bomb this nuclear enrichment facility or chemical weapons facility. They weren't going to take the risk. But that also doesn't mean that there isn't concern about nuclear proliferation, because it also illustrates, as we talked about earlier in this stream, about alliance-dependent nations. The United States, right, and other countries on the NATO blocs gave these reassurances for security under the Budapest Memorandum in the 1990s, which, of course, gets talked about a lot when we refer to the Crimean Peninsula being taken. Neither of them, however, I mean, these security agreements were given with often very empty words. In fact, even George H.W. Bush said that none of these security agreements were ratified by the Senate. They're not really going to be enforced. They don't have a lot of teeth. And especially at the end of the Cold War, there was no way in hell, right, that the United States, Europe, NATO, especially a reunified Germany, mind you, were going to allow a former Soviet republic whose government may or may not be corrupt that would have nuclear weapons. So a lot of the former Soviet republics that had them, you sent them back to Russia to be dismantled per disarmament treaties and agreements and diplomacy as, the Soviet Union transitioned into the Russian Federation. All of which, right, it talks about those fears and concerns. And of course, that's why, again, as we talked about at the beginning, we see why nations pursue them, because this is for the security of your, national sovereignty, your territorial sovereignty of your borders and your people. And that's something, of course, which a lot of more, I guess I want to say hawkish, I guess they would like to see tensions escalate between the United States or the West, quote unquote, and Russia by, let's just go put a nuclear armed state that has been openly persuaded and color revolutioned into being pro-Western and pro-American. Now let's give them nuclear weapons, right? That would be a concern. But let's take a look at chat, because I know that some of you guys were making some very good points here. After Afghanistan, says Christoph Smuts, any ally of the United States should be sweating bullets, especially if they are already at war. Yeah, that's a concern about all of the discussions. I mean, even the discussions about the worth of an American promise goes far back as the end of the Cold War. There were numerous individuals in both the George H.W. Bush and Reagan administration that were very realistic in the assessment of what the world would look like at the end of the Cold War, especially when it came to like nuclear weapons or armaments. Because the United States, becoming this unipolar power was done so at a time of European multipolar decline and emerges from a victory in a very bloody conflict. Give me a second. I need some water here. And so the United States never experienced, imperial engagement in a world where it wasn't just the United States and the Soviet Union. And in so doing so, the United States was woefully unprepared for a multipolar world order. I talked about this in the Ebola and modern warfare video. And while at the same time, it's still an ongoing concern, which is why we see this rapid reposturing of the American military apparatus, whether it's with the AUKUS agreement, encouraging the Japanese to conduct military drills, or informing the Indians and the Japanese in the Quad agreement, right, about what is going to happen next, especially with these agreements. So there's a lot in there. And some arguments would say, from an isolationist perspective, that actually, no, let the Japanese have nuclear weapons. The United States has no business being in this area. We have committed ourselves to rebuilding Japan. We have committed ourselves to helping out the South Koreans and the Australians. Let the Japanese have nuclear weapons, especially because there's been a lot of push from the National Democratic Party, the NDP, or Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, which is the ruling party in Japan, sort of like how the PRI was in Mexico. With Shinzo Abe, and now with the current prime minister being the former minister of defense, all of which illustrates the need that Japan is capable of producing its own technology. The Taiwanese semiconductor, facility moved from Taiwan to Japan not too long ago. I think it was 2 weeks ago. All sort of setting up this concern over Taiwan. But you can find sections of this in book reviews on JSTOR and PDFs of the chapters online. It's a really good read, and it's a really good debate that I think deserves to be revisited time and time again, especially as we look at more nuclear-armed states or more nuclear diplomacy being discussed. So some final thoughts and the conclusion for today's lecture. While a nuclear weapons-free world is often discussed and idealized in diplomacy, whether it is about complete disarmament, like people like Jacinda Ardern of Ardern in New Zealand, or numerous individuals like the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, it is an idealized world. It will most likely stay that way. I do not think until either greater technologies are invented, or the idea of newer weapons that can pretty much outclass nuclear weapons, I do not think that a nuclear-free world will exist. States are always going to continue to pursue them in some fashion. While we do have regulatory bodies, whether it's the International Association of Atomic Scientists or the International Atomic Energy Agency, all of which I think are going to be our best bet in this current way in the world around them. So all of this illustrates, I think, that a nuclear weapons-free world isn't going to go anywhere. On top of that, right, most nation states are what we call rational actors, especially in a realist worldview. The fear, and has been properly discussed amongst realists, whether it's Barry Posen, whether it's Mearsheimer, whether it's Waltz, even people who are rational choice theorists, right, like James Dearferon, who look at security issues. All of them look at this is that the primary fear is non-state actors. So, in fact, the fact that Pakistan does militants, they make sure that their weapons are disassembled, I think that that's a very interesting thing. I mean, that's a good way to mitigate the likelihood that non-state actors get their hands on fissile material, which is excellent. It's a policy. I think that's very good. However, that doesn't mean that traditional warfare isn't going to go away either. We're aware of deterrence, we're aware of our triad, we're aware of what technologies are being pursued, but that doesn't mean that limited engagements and conflict will most likely happen. As we see here with a military parade of India showing off some of their missiles as well. But it does give credence, right, to some of the rational choice discussions that we were having earlier. Although I was criticizing it earlier, I think that between actual nation states that have nuclear weapons, the predictions and probability calculations of the destruction of said nuclear weapons that can levy against a respective country highlights the importance of engaging in diplomacy. And the nuclear diplomacy is still an ongoing issue that we talk about today, especially when it comes to between nuclear armed states and actors. I've for the longest time have talked about on this channel and on this ongoing show the importance, I think, of Russian rapprochement between the United States and the Russian Federation, or at least with the West, because that would allow you to sort of do a Sino-Soviet split 2.0 and sort of moving these two countries away from each other, at least in terms of trade and these sort of security agreements they have along the Eurasian region. While I know recently there has been announcements from the Russians that Russia and China will not engage in any sort of mutual defense stuff, I do think that there's a lot that Russia is also easily very wary about when it comes with China. China would easily be in its backyard when it comes to Eurasian issues with the Belt and Road initiatives that they're looking at, whether it's in Pakistan, trying to get to Iran and Turkey, through Afghanistan, all of which is basically in Russia's backyard. And at the same time, right, puts Russia on the periphery for trade, energy resources, and military support and investment in security in that region. So all of which puts us in a very strange position in the world of nuclear diplomacy, but it heightens the importance of diplomacy, non-proliferation, and testing, because we have decades of, not only generations living in fear of said weapons, but we have generations of footage and understanding of what these weapons can do. Regardless of what your position is on nuclear weapons, the fact that we have them and we treat them with this, I don't want to say reverence or veneration, but we treat them with the gravity and the seriousness that they have, I think tells us everything that we need to know, that these are not going away anytime soon. Nations are going to be, putting themselves out there in a way that nuclear weapons aren't going to be going away anytime soon. And I think that those are my thoughts there. Let's see here. Tom Nguyen asks, what are your opinion of Putin saying that there will not be a war between China and Taiwan? I mean, Tom, next week is what we're talking about is the Taiwan issue in the South China Sea. So do not worry. We will be talking about that. But as we talk about nuclear weapons and we reach the end of today's lecture and this hour-long conversation, we now get to move on to everyone's favorite part of the show, which is time for Frog of the Week. But before I get there, some announcements. So last Saturday, yesterday, I had a lovely time with patrons doing a community night. We played a few games on Steam and such. I set up a Discord server for voice chat because it's a little more reliable than Telegram, and that's used exclusively for just communication and gaming, for things like that. It was a lot of fun. I might make that every month. I'll do it twice on a weekend. It was a really good time. So Substack, I realized that writing weekly is not something I can do with my current workload, going to the doctor and putting together videos and the weekly show. So it'll be a bi-weekly thing, or a bi-monthly thing, so twice a month. It'll be a fun time. I do enjoy writing. I think it's a nice way to get my creative juices out, as well as just talk about things that I don't think make for a good video. Like the one that I'm going to have out on Monday is going to be about just urban development and something that I'm seeing from the countryside. So it'll be a lot of things to talk about there. I think it'll be fun. But yeah, it'll be out twice, at least 2 times a month it'll come out. So this Thursday will be another Substack reading talking about the issue of chastity. And this will allow me to get more work done on some of the longer form videos that I want to get out there. But if you're not subscribed to my Substack, don't worry. I like narrating these. I think that they make for good videos. There was a lot of positive feedback in the discussion over this week's video about finding meaning amongst the ruin, which I greatly appreciate. I'm glad that you guys liked that one. And then, of course, I'm putting out some movie reviews. I'm probably going to do one on the movie Her. I feel like it is the most horrifying Bugman future that you can think of when it comes to like AI digital girlfriends and things like that. So that one's being worked on. And the one after that will be the 1941 movie Sergeant York. And then there might be just a quick little rant-esque video coming out this week, the whole Jesse Kelly thing on Twitter about kicking his kids out at 18 and then doubling down to talk about internet anons and being mad that Christians are angry at him for having multi-generational households. It irks the absolute crap out of me, and everyone's been having their takes on it. So I'm just going to do a quick little rant on that, similar to the time with New York Magazine and secession. And then last but not least, working on the longer scripted video projects, which is going to be on masculinity and politics. I really like where I'm taking it, and I think that you guys will really enjoy it too. So it'll be probably 30, 45 minutes, hopefully, in length once I'm done with just these outline and sketches. So that's definitely happening. And I think that you guys are really going to like that one. There's a lot of arguments and sources and some footage I'm going to pull it. So don't worry, it's coming, so stay tuned. Tuesday asks me, are 1 billion Americans inevitable? If Matt Iglesias has his way, there'll be 1 billion Americans and some sort of ethnic food stand on every corner. This is his idea. Like, it's the dumbest China hawk take I have ever seen. And I am not a fan of it. So no, not at all. I don't want it to be inevitable, but I don't think it will be. I don't think that it's remotely feasible, because there's even progressive pushback on certain aspects of immigration. Philip Cafaro has a really good book about called "How Many Is Too Many," and I would recommend reading it. It's a really good book. It's sort of what is my go-to when talking to normies or leftists about immigration. So there's a lot in there. And as Robin Watertree says, Americans with quotation marks. Yeah, I share the view of Louis Levi that they're paper Americans and nothing else. There's no actual allegiance or national identity. But yeah, so on to Frog of the Week, ladies and gentlemen. So, since we talked about nuclear weapons and we talked about the Cold War and the Soviet Union, I thought that it would be a good time for us to discuss the, Siberian wood frog, which we can find in quite a few places in Eastern Asia and Eastern Russia, and northern parts of Russia as well, as quite a span for habitats, mainly in the lowlands. You can find it in Russia, China, Mongolia, and the Korean Peninsula. The Siberian wood frog is just one of many names that this frog has, but I thought that it would be fun to just make it a Russian frog for today, since we talked about nuclear weapons. Its eyes closed during the water for most of the time. It makes it very difficult to see because it prefers lowlands and rocks, and is very found oftentimes in clear water. And they're found primarily in marshy lowlands, rivers, and streams that are typically not in any elevation above 600 meters or so above sea level. So they are a very lowland kind of frog. They are mainly insectivores. They'll eat beetles, which consists of their diet most of the time. They are brown in their body colors, you can see with the image, and they usually have smoother skin than most frogs, although they are a little bit of bumpy and so what. But it makes it very difficult to find them when you're in, clear water, brown areas, something in which conservationists have talked about, making it very hard for them to see. However, though, if you were to flip the frog over along their legs and their bellies, there are usually bright orange speckles and spots that you can see all over it. It's quite pretty to look at. They're also incredibly small frogs. They are only about an inch big, fully grown, and that's the females, because of when they're sexually dimorphic. The males are about 0.75, 3/4 of an inch long in terms of their size fully developed. But they live for about 3 years. They have a 3-year lifespan, and they breed incredibly early. That their mating season begins usually in late February, and they will spawn usually sometime in the spring. The females can lay anywhere between 50 to 65 eggs at that time. So that is the Siberian wood frog. And let's see what everyone's asking about said frog. Suno Samar asks, Prudentialist, have you tried kissing a frog and turning it into a princess? No, I don't think I will. And with my immunosuppressed butt, I don't think I'm going to be kissing a frog anytime soon. But I'm not going to risk it. I just prefer finding nice older women to recommend me ladies at church. Record Deepness says, finally, the meat and potatoes of the stream. Good to know. But yes, the numbers always go up during Frog of the Week. It's always nice to see that. But now I'll just hang out with all of you guys for a little bit and just have a nice, lovely conversation. I know that Mr. Barbarossa became a channel member. Thank you so much. You will get to see videos earlier than everybody else who is normally subscribed, and you'll have access to the gaming Discord for patrons and subscribe star and channel members only. So if that's something that you're into, twice a month we'll probably do that on a weekend. I had a lot of fun doing it yesterday. I'll probably put a little video footage together just to sell the idea if that's something that you're into. And if not, no worries, you still get to see videos early. And yeah, that's all that I have really all for you today. I'm glad that you all showed up, and thank you so much for understanding that I had to move it just a little bit later. I know that Mr. Semigog is streaming, so if you are watching right now, and as we reach our conclusion, I sincerely hope that all of you head over there once we wrap up here. But I wanted to touch base on a couple of things that I saw being talked about earlier. I do think that the move in regards to the Taiwan issue, and we'll talk about this next week, I do think that the semiconductor factories moving illustrates that there's probably going to be a move on reunification, either in the next few months or sometime next year. I do not think that there's saber rattling, but I don't think the United States has the political will or capital in a traditional sense to defend it. The question gets raised, right? Like, how many soldiers, how many people on top of the mandates, on top of the ongoing politics inside of the military right now? How many are really willing to lay their lives down for Taiwan? I know there's a lot of like manufacturing stuff that is explicitly for the argument about war happening between the two. I just don't see the United States having it. I think that what's probably going to happen is moving it away. Yeah. When's the Nord Stream? And again, the Russian rapprochement stuff is coming. Those are the scripted stuff that I'm working on. And neither is Taiwan prepared to militarily defend itself, despite American presence being on there. So yeah. King of Games is warning me. I know about the whole Discord thing. I use it explicitly for gaming. That's literally what it's only for, is for those that want to actually use if they want to game as a supporter, we have that option available to them. That's all that it's there for. The Telegram and the Matrix stuff that I'm working on right now are going to be the alternatives in the future. And I'm well aware that there are people that dox on Telegram, and I saw that recently. So if you're already on the Telegram, or if you'd like to join it, I do have some OPSEC and some moderation already on there. I have the chat auto set to delete within 1 week. So it all works out. There's all so much that you can do about defending your identity, and I already have contingency stuff in mind for when I think the inevitable happens. Tuesday asking a rather spicy question. I will simply just say no. I don't think that it'll happen, but with the recent news that the Queen is ill and is required for bed rest, I think that it will be an end of an era for that part of Britain, and more specifically England. So it'll be a moment of lament, and it'll be a moment of concern, because that's the end of an era of decline, kind of coming to completion. So yeah, I don't think that will happen, but certainly it will be far more paused than it was before. Glow in the dark, I would agree with you that it'll most likely be political will and political movements going to lead to annexation of Crimea and things like, or annexation of Taiwan, excuse me, than actual military engagement. I really just do not see a war breaking out. It's not really worth it. But with all that, ladies and gentlemen, let's head on over to Mr. Semigog's stream. He's got Anteos on. We're going to get some really neat esoteric knowledge as usual. Thank you all so much for tuning into today's stream. I'll see you all next Sunday as we talk about Taiwan and the South China Sea. And with all that, I'll see you all next time. Take care, everybody, and be prudent.